911 responders, what is a call that you will never forget? This isn't mine, but a friend of mine fielded this call. An elderly gentleman called 911 to notify them that his wife had passed in her sleep. Only it was like 7 o'clock at night. Apparently, he just couldn't deal with it emotionally. So he got her dressed, took her out to the car, and drove around doing his errands for the day. Watched some TV together. And then, after 12 or so hours, he finally sort of accepted that she was gone and called 911. Story 2. Someone called stating they had seen a man on a small island on the lake hours ago, but now the man was gone and his boat is still out there. An older woman called in a half hour later, stating her husband had gone missing. He was last seen taking his boat out on the lake sometime overnight. The increasing tension in her voice as she noticed sheriff's deputies were already dredging. The lake was something else. She was calm, but clearly actively dealing with the fact her husband was likely passed. They found his body not long after I hung up with her. Sometimes it's the people screaming that get to you. Sometimes it's the quiet acceptance of a horrible truth that stays with you long. Story 3. Man called to report a male was breaking into his neighbor's vehicle across the street. A few minutes into the call, the man came and started to break into the caller's vehicle. A few minutes later, the man spotted my caller and broke into his house from the window. Spent 10 minutes listening to physical fight when I finally heard the police enter the house and say, "There's red liquid everywhere." Both intruder and caller pass. Oh, and another 911 dispatcher had my caller's wife, and kids on another line who were hiding upstairs and heard everything. I talked to a lot of people in the final moments of their lives, but you usually get them after the situation occurred. This caller was just trying to look out for his neighbor, and I spent a good 20 minutes bantering while waiting for officers to arrive and get the auto thief, getting to joke around and get to know someone's personality before they pass. Hit a lot different than taking a call after abuse had occurred. Story 4. I'm not a first responder, but in 2007, my 4 friends and I were driving home at 2 a.m. one night on the highway. No, we were not drinking that night. And up ahead in the distance, I could faintly see something in the middle of the road. It was pitch dark, and I slowed down and kept saying, WTF is that? Over and over again. Well, we slowed down and realized it was a black car with no headlights on, just sitting in the middle of the road demolished. I pulled over, and me and all my friends sprinted to the car and checked it to see if anyone was inside. There was a woman in driver's seat who definitely didn't survive the initial crash. Face just completely embedded into the windshield. I can still see this image till this day. And we were looking as fast as we could because we were in the middle of I-95 and thankfully no other cars had come by. We heard a child faintly crying and my friend looks in the back seat and sees there is a child in a car seat who didn't look injured. So we tried to open the door and it wouldn't fully open due to the damage to the car. So we all had to pull at this door to get it open, and let me tell you, as easy as it sounds, that was no easy task for 4 18-year-old kids. But eventually we got it open just enough to get in there and pull the child out. We get to the side of the road. And in the blink of an eye, a semi comes full speed and pulverizes the car and drags it about 100 feet before coming to a complete stop. We called the state police and they came 15 minutes later, and we waited with the child until they came and questioned us. We were called heroes by all the officers. Later investigations revealed that she came around the turn too fast and hit the guardrail and died on impact. On the way home, nobody made a damn sound. Story 5. I do search and rescue work. Got a call to respond to a missing lady in her 60s, gone overnight. Police had been searching for hours with no luck, so by the time I got there, she had been missing for over 16 hours. This was my K9's first search ever, so I was super nervous but also proud that we could help. The police kept trying to hold me to a small 10-acre set of woods, but my gut said trust my dog. She wasn't there. The police officer got angry with me and decided to go back to the 10 acres while I continued with my K9 into a new area. 5 minutes later, my dog gives an alert and I watch which way she went. I climbed over a huge tree to find the lady standing there in shock. She went passed out as soon as I said who I was and asked her what her name was. After years of being told I was wasting my time, my dog was crap. And if I wanted to do SAR, I should get a real dog. It was the most amazing feeling in the world. My K9 is almost retired, has multiple fines and a recovery under her paws now, and she's just simply amazing. Story 6. Harley motorcycle tipped over and the clutch lever hit a 4-year-old's eye. Parent was on the line asking what to do. Suddenly she said, "They're going lift the motorcycle." I emphatically told her to tell them to stop and wait for rescue and EMS. Rescue ended up cutting off the clutch lever and transporting the kid to hospital. She underwent surgery. That was 1982. Just last year, I met the lead rescue officer and the girl herself, now fully grown. They wanted to meet the 911 operator that saved her vision. Story 7. I'm not a first responder anymore, but one of my first arson cases was an absolutely hilarious disaster. This husband and wife hated each other but didn't want to get divorced. What they did want was a new house. So they poured kerosene on approximately 60 rags and stuffed them under the end table next to the couch. Then placed an empty kerosene lamp on the end table. Then they took a 5-gallon gas can full of gas, took the spout off, and placed it in their master bedroom closet. They're completely devoid of all clothing master bedroom closet, except for 2 jackets with tassels with the price tags still on them. Then they opened all their safes and left them empty and open in the middle of the bedroom. Then they took all the pictures out of the house and replaced them with random photos they printed off the internet. Then they removed the televisions and replaced them with old TVs. They put the flat-screen televisions in their barn. Then they poured a clear trail of gasoline down the hallway. Their alibi was that on the day of the fire, they were trying to sell their canoe. They finally got a buyer, but the only time they could meet the buyer was at 3 a.m. that night. So they drove 2 hours away to sell a canoe at 3 a.m. the very same night. They then tried to claim the unlit, non-electric kerosene lamp must have exploded. Then they claimed that their attic neighbors were trying to frame them for arson. Then the husband claimed that his wife was trying to frame him for arson because she's, quote, "They are notorious for not wanting to work." Then he claimed that Sears was trying to frame him for arson because they were tired of paying his settlement after being injured at work 25 years prior. It was a good time. Story 8. My father uses to be a 911 dispatcher, was also an EMT for 5 years, and a firefighter for over 30 years. Worst call he ever took was a woman who called that her house was on fire. She was trapped in the burning house and could not get out. First responders did not make it in time. He had to stay on the line with and listen to her as she passed. He also witnessed, while responding to a death call, one of his friends want to end his life, but he was still alive after that. They saved his life. He also responded to an ATV rollover of one of his friend's kids. ATV hit kid's face. Kid survived. There are countless other calls that I could tell. My dad has witnessed a lot. Nicest man you will ever meet. Story 9. Not a first responder, but I work in the ED. One of our physician's friends is a first responder and got a call for death. It was his own house, his daughter, and her life. Story 10. My friend is a first responder. He once got a call about a man that had fallen in the shower. He gets there and the guy is over 400 pounds and out cold on the bathroom floor. My friend, his partner, and the guy's roommate try everything they can think of to get the guy on the stretcher. But the bathroom is tiny, and they can't even roll him over. Eventually, they call 2 more ambulances and finally get the guy out of the bathroom. They get to the elevator, and it's too small to fit the guy on the stretcher. So 6 paramedics have to carry the guy down 5 flights of stairs. My friend called in sick for the rest of the week because he was so sore and stiff. He couldn't move. Story 11. I once had a call from a girl who was just hit by her stepfather. She kicked him in the balls and went to hide and call 911. She was scared, and I stayed on the line until her stepfather found her. The last thing I heard was her yelling, "No, please don't do it again." Then I heard an angry yell, then gurgling. Turns out he hit her 1 minute before the police got there. I quit the next day. Story 12. A couple weeks ago, I responded to a woman in labor. Get on scene, she had just delivered. She was naked and holding the baby. She was high and trying to do substances one last time before she went with us. Story 13. Got a call for a death mail. Went to the house and we could see through the glass someone holding a big knife, but it looked to be a female. It was some type of stained glass stuff. So we asked what's going on and if Brian, names have been changed, was home. She yelled, "Brian isn't here anymore," which, isn't great to hear from someone holding a knife. So we make entry into the house and, after much confusion, figure out that the lady we saw through the window was actually Brian and was transitioning, or had transitioned, to Brianna. She was in her 50s and had been struggling for a long time because she'd worked at a place with the same coworkers for 20 years. And after starting her transition, she was made fun of and left out of conversation. Her family wasn't supportive, and apparently when she went online to seek help from groups, she was too old and wasn't accepted by them either. So she wanted to end her life because of how alone she felt. I was able to chat with her for a while and convinced her to go to the hospital. She was going to go regardless, but there's less stress, danger for everyone if they come voluntarily. When we arrived at the hospital, she said she was too scared to get out of the car. My shift had ended like 30 minutes earlier. I asked her if holding my hand would help. She said yes. So I get out of the car and hold her hand walking into the hospital. I'm 5 feet 6 inches, and she's at least 6 feet 2 inches and outweighs me by 100 pounds. So I'm holding her hand, and my hand is like at eye level for me. We go in, and I tell the nurse at the air that this is Brianna, and she's having a bad night, code for wanting to hit herself. The nurse gets her a room, which is where we part ways. I say something to her about getting help and happier days ahead, and she quietly asks for a hug before I go. I say sure, and give her a hug. Sometimes I wonder if she found a support group, and if not, if she's still around. I hope so. Story 14. Was an EMT before I became a nurse. Call came in for an MVC, motor vehicle, with 2 trapped. On arrival, cops said 2 young women, early 20s, drinking and going too fast and flipped their car. Driver ejected. Then we hear passenger screaming, "She's pregnant. Be careful, she's pregnant." Jaws hit the floor as the smell of alcohol on both them and their car. We wanted to airlift the driver, but medic on scene said no. She had fractured literally almost every bone in her body. Open, compound fracture, and fractured femur. Normal protocol didn't work because we can't mast pants because she has massive pelvic trauma, fractures. We transported both of them together and not sure how we kept driver alive. She obviously lost the baby. Rushed her in for emergency surgery. First bad accident scene as an EMT. Story 15. I work in a region that covers a lot of forest area. I was patrolling and heading to recertify with my firearms when I passed vehicle tracks leading into the trees where vehicles aren't supposed to be. It wasn't unusual for that spot, but I'd never been able to catch anyone up there. Because I was on a timetable, I figured I'd check in it on the way back to the office after an hour or so. We got a bolo for a potentially death man. He was found dead a couple of hours later. In that exact area, I was going to check. And now, I can't help but wonder if he was alive when I drove by and I could have done something. Story 16. A 911 dispatcher here. There's many that stick with me, but the absolute hardest one was a mother finding her child after the child passed. She was absolutely destroyed. But I could clearly hear her fighting to keep control as I walked her through, getting the child down and attempting CPR. I knew that child was gone, but the mother refused to give up. I stayed with her on the phone and counted compressions with her while we waited for PD and the AMBO to arrive. Listened to her alternate between counting and begging her child to come back. When the EMTS showed up and took over, she finally let it go. That scream broke me, and I can still hear it to this day. Story 17. I'm not a first responder, but a dentistry student. Dentistry professionals can work in the hospital as trauma surgeons of the face. This facial surgeon showed us a case of a man that didn't pay his dealers. They hit his face and left. Surprisingly, the man survived and woke up half an hour later and called the police. They spent hours trying to pinpoint his exact locating, because at this point he was somewhere in the middle of an open field. And obviously, he lost eyes anymore to help them. He was taken to the hospital, and his surgery took 18 hours, but he did survive. Today, he lives in a rest home with a tube helping him breathe and another helping him eat. Story 18. Volunteer firefighter in Europe. Some summers ago, we were called as first responders to a motorcycle accident. When we arrived, the cyclist was obviously badly hurt after crashing in a car, but he was orientated and seemed okay. Ambulance and helicopter were on their way already, so we just had to stabilize him. Not a minute later, he started deteriorating. Another minute later, we started CPR. One of the arriving bystanders was a trauma surgeon and started helping immediately, shortly after the doctor on the helicopter arrived. It was obvious that there was massive internal bleeding. They first tried to relieve pressure by puncturing and then pretty soon decided that the only chance was to open him up. One started to give the heart direct compressions. The blood loss was too extreme, and he passed there. Still to this day, I have to drive slowly when I pass by that stretch of road. Story 19. I remember odd things people say under stress. Guy who came back from the market to find his partner pass. Come on, buddy, don't do this. It's Valentine's Day. Homeless passerby who started CPR on a distraught woman's husband who collapsed at a gas pump. Story 20. My first cardiac arrest call. An old lady had woken up to her husband not breathing. He'd passed at some point during the night, it seems, but all I was given at the start of the call was that he wasn't breathing, so I launched into CPR instruction. They lived out of town, so it took the ambulance crew about 25 minutes to get out to them. There was nothing crazy about the call, and I've dealt with way more traumatic calls in the 2 years since. But at some point, during the call, she realized he was gone and you could hear it in her voice. That shift in tone is what sticks with me. Story 21. Got a call for a 3-month-old baby that was not responsive. Arrived on scene, and was the second person through the door right behind the senior fire officer, SFO. SFO immediately began doing CPR and was therefore unable to take on role of incident commander. I quickly reached up and grabbed the radio off his side and assumed command and control. This happened several years ago, and I can still clearly see the child's face. That was a hard day knowing that there was literally nothing we could do but trying our darndest to do whatever we could. We never did find out the cause of pass. Story 22, a lighthearted one. My friend got a call from a very cross-sounding old lady that was absolutely furious because her neighbors had stolen her plants. When my friend asked her how she knew it was them, the woman said, "Because there's holes in my yard and she planted them in her damn garden. I'm going to go take them back. I have a shovel, and you probably won't get here in time to do anything about it." Thank goodness it was a slow day because my friend had to stay on the line for at least 15 minutes to convince her to wait for a cop to come by and talk to her neighbors for her. Story 23. One of my first calls ever. Calls drops on the radio. So-and-so 40-ish years old, female, low blood sugar, diabetic complications. The EMT training me, E, and his paramedic partner, P, are familiar with the address and said it would be a good call for me to drive code 1, lights and sirens, 2, as each was very confident this woman wasn't dying. It was my first Code 1 experience. We arrived to the scene, and just before entering the resident, I'm talking on its very porch. E pulls me aside and says something to the effect of, "Now, when we go in there, the patient, PT, is going to be completely naked laying at the bottom of her stairs. She has bilateral, below the knee amputation. And when we give her some sugar, she's going to wake up and do naked, nubby gymnastics all over the place. Oh, and it's going to be hot as hell inside because she gets cold when her sugar is low." When E and I went inside, we were hit with 100 degrees room temperature on an already hot day. P had already pulled up a chair in the living room and began adding demographic information and history to our patient care report. Business as usual. The patient, as promised, was laying at the bottom of her stairs, completely naked, completely disoriented, effectively the mind of a toddler, and legoless as can be. As my first diabetic emergency, I was taking a back seat and observing a treat the PT. Carefully approached PT and struggled with her a bit to get a BGL reading. Her sugar was alarmingly low for a healthy person, but not far from her average, and certainly not her record low, as noted by E. After obtained the BGL reading, E had the green light to attempt to administer a dose of oral glucose, a really sticky, really disgusting toothpaste-like substance. PT wasn't having it. She started spitting and pulling away, and ultimately was left unchanged. Now it was P's turn. A nice shot of glucagon, and within minutes, PT was speaking in tongues and spinning naked cartwheels on her stumps. Amazing. P had just sat back down when PT had gone face down, ass up about 3-ish feet in front of PA. PT paused, and then started back up into a tantrum akin to an exorcism. After several minutes of the most awkwardly surreal experience of my life, PT had transitioned into a sort of recovery phase that entailed sitting on the heating vent and shouting, "I'm so cold!" at the top of her lungs over and over. No, we didn't adjust the thermostat. Eventually, PT became coherent and adamantly refused transport to the hospital for further treatment. Then she ate the breakfast her daughter made and we left. I've seen PT a few times since, but he's in prison now, so it's been a while. I've never seen her with clothes on, even during discharges from the hospital. Story 24. Firefighter EMT recent call, actually still fresh in memory only 2 days ago. Fatal accident, 16-year-old female deceased at the scene, low speed, 20 km/h accident, but airbags deployed. Should have been a simple move. The cars get them home, but she had her feet on the dashboard and the airbags broke her legs. So if you ever get the idea putting your feet up on the dash is a good idea. Don't. Story 25. Had a call for a patient who hit himself on fire but decided he still wanted to live after 3 seconds, so he jumped into a lake, which was coincidentally nearby. So he obviously had doubts as to whether or not he actually wanted to die. We got him fully intubated, IVs, and all the works. Story 26. I work in maritime search and rescue. I was fairly new at my job, and the area is quite large that we are in charge of. I just showed up maybe a month prior, still learning the area. We get a call that 2 smaller private planes had collided mid-air. It was a horrible day. In total, there were 19 people. We only found 12 people. 8 were deceased, and out of the rest who survived. 2 later to pass due to complications on the way to the hospital. Anyone that survived was a miracle, to say the least. This was almost a year ago, and we still get reports that parts of the plane are washing ashore. Story 27. Obligatory. I'm not a 911 responder intro, but the one and only time I ever had to call 911 was interesting. It was around 1997, and I lived in a suburb of Atlanta. I was getting on I-85NB and looked over and saw a car on fire on the I-85 SB. I grabbed my cell phone and called 911. Now I had purchased the phone in Fayetteville where I lived. The car fire was happening in Union City about 15 miles away. Call went like this. Operator, 911, what is your emergency? Yeah, I'm getting on 85N at Union City, gave her the exit number, and there is a car on fire on the southbound ramp. Operator, sir, you've called Fayetteville 911. You'll need to call Union City 911. Me, how the heck do I dial a different 911? What, do I need to put in an area code first? Operator, big dramatic sigh. Hold on. Proceeds to put me on hold for about 90 seconds, comes back on the line. Operator, very rude tone. Sir, someone else has already called that in. Fire and ambulance are already on their way. Me, geez, I'm so sorry to have bothered you with this potentially deadly emergency. Operator, click. She seemed nice. Story 28. A nice call. I delivered a baby who came into the world just as we got all set up in the ambulance. A healthy baby boy and everything went perfectly as planned. It was a great call. Story 29. Former deputy. One morning I was the early person in to take calls as the night shift was headed out and to cover what trickled in as shift change took place. It's cold and rainy and miserable all around. I'm on my way to someone's house to talk to them about a phone scam when a call comes out to another unit who just marked on duty. He lives across the county from where this call came out. A mother has called in stating her little girl got out of the house while she was getting her ready for a bath. Her daughter is nonverbal and naked. and Mom can't find her. Everyone that owned a radio in the county started to mark en route last night's shift. Court bailiffs, the damn major. Everyone was coming. I actually had to wait to get onto the radio to let dispatch know I was now in the area, turning onto the road. The way this road was situated was a hairpin turn off a highway that led to a dead end at a lake with a stretch in the middle of it going up towards the houses. As I make this right turn and am about to head up towards the resident, something catches my eye. This little girl is standing at the edge of this lake, just staring at it. I bolt from my car, snatch her up in my coat, and start hoofing it back towards the houses. Some stranger just grabbed her and she's crying and trying to wiggle free. Mom sees me about halfway and nearly tackles me as she comes in for the biggest hug probably any of us has ever experienced. The baby was cold, but safe and unharmed. We made sure to get Mom in contact with a resource that would get her little girl a tracking bracelet, and she rejoiced to learn that such a thing existed. A couple days later, the mom delivered flowers and a card to me at the office. I still have it, years later, and it still makes me smile. Sure, there's some stories of horrible things, but there's also good calls you can't forget. Although I have real mixed feelings about my time in law enforcement, I know that day I did good. Story 30. Memorial Day, 1989. At the time, call dispatched as a car into a telephone pole. When we got there, I couldn't believe the carnage. A HS student had been given a muscle car as a birthday present. The police later estimated he was going over 90 miles per hour when he hit the pole head-on. He had other multiple injuries. It took us 2 hours to cut him out of the car. The medics were pumping him so full of substance. To maintain his blood pressure, they started to openly worry that they might duck his kidneys up. We finally got him out of the car, only time I've ever seen a KED used, on a gurney and took off for the hospital. Medic had 2 large-bore IVs going and had a BP cuff wrapped around one of the bags to create his own rapid infuser. The kid lived. The irony was that the kid was an MI state indoor track and field state champion runner. Story 31. I responded POV to a motorcycle crash as a volunteer EMT in a small mountain town. A lady was coming down a rocky canyon when her husband believes she likely feels asleep. Medically related drowsiness in her history. She launched Dukes of Hazzard style off the road edge about 50 feet with 30 feet drop into a mat of bushes. Her body hit and snapped a 4 to 5 inches diameter fir tree. There were civilians all over and down in the ditch helping her already. Nobody on scene yet. Volunteer FD just arriving, and air med en route too. I get down to her, and she is on a Good Samaritan's backboard. After a quick assessment and some ABC's mitigation, I decide it's best to get her to the road. We can hardly stand in the brambles, and taking vitals is a nightmare. With the help of civilians and the local Type 4 Forest Service fire engine, we got her up to the road. The extent of her injuries were later relayed to us by the Air Med service. She had rapid and irregular breathing, but absent breath sounds. Both lungs were collapsed, on both sides. Her vitals were not good, and she would only make pain noises. Sometimes the words were audible about her back pain. Convening with the flight medics, her outlook did not look great, and I helped load her up into the bird thinking she would be lucky if she made it to the hospital. Fast forward a year-ish. Later, she walked into the Forest Service I worked at looking for me to say thank you. I was in the field that day, so I was not able to meet with her, but it was a great reminder as to why I got my EMT in the first place. I was astonished and so thankful to hear of her recovery. Story 32. I'm not a first responder, but my sister's is a Leo. Her worst story was there were 2 addicts in town, criminals who had multiple children together, all which had been taken away by Children's Aid Service. So there was a report that she had given birth, so KAS wanted police escort to go get the baby. They knocked on the door, the dad opened it and just said, "Oh, you're here for the baby," walked across the room, picked up a swaddled baby and handed the child to my sister. She looked at the baby, this was something like her 3rd or 4th actual shift, started shaking and crying. The sergeant sees this, says give it and get back to the car. The baby had been passed for a couple days already. My sister is okay with things now, but that one messed her up for a bit. Story 33. Ran a run of the Millhouse fire in a McMansion. The fire was small enough we could perform an interior attack, but big enough that it was a little dicey and hot as duck. Go up into the 2nd floor master bedroom, and where the walk-in closet should have been was a sex place. For years after that fire, a charred sex toy would magically appear in turnout boots, pockets, inside helmets, anywhere inconvenient you can think of. Story 34. Obligatory. I'm not a first responder, but I always wonder about the 911 operator that was on the phone with me when I found my 21F at the time, brother, 24M, after he ended his life. It's a bit blurry, but I remember I was calm, in shock. And I think he started to ask if I needed fire, police, or ambulance. And as soon as he spoke, I said, "My brother ended his life." I think he asked if I could get him down and try CPR, but as I said, his feet are blue. He knew he had passed and instructed me to go wait outside on my steps and to stay on the phone till the police got there. I kept saying things like, "This is so ducked up. I'm sorry for swearing." And he said it's okay. Later, I found out that I found my brother about 14 hours after it happened. My poor parents were out of town on vacation, too. I called them first before I even called 911. I always hope it didn't make the operator sad. Story 35. One of my favorites is doing overhaul on a house fire and finding a pocket pussy in all the rubble, untouched, in the middle of the teenage boy's room. I don't know what was funnier, finding the pocket pussy or seeing the kid trying to explain to his mom that he had no idea how it got there. Story 36. Not a first responder, but my instructor for my MT class told us about the worst call he's ever been on. He said they got a call one night and sent 5 ambulances to the scene. He was in the third. They arrive on scene to a car accident where a drunk teenager hit a family's car. The father and the son were ejected from the car and were already about to be transported, and the teenager had fled the scene. My instructor was tasked with getting the other family members out of the car, the pregnant wife and 3 kids. Sadly, they all pass on impact and nothing could be done for them. He had to retrieve their bodies and sit with them for something over an hour, if my memory serves, with the knowledge that if the father and son lived, which they did, they would wake up to hear the terrible news of what happened to the rest of their family, and live with the fact that the kid who hit them was almost uninjured. The story sounds awful enough just hearing about. I can't even imagine what he must have gone through. Story 37. I'm a 911 operator. The hardest call I've ever gotten. Boy was in the state's custody, and his sister had took him and his maybe 5-year-old brother out for the day to spend time together. The boy was in the water, and all of a sudden, the sister couldn't find him. A bystander called 911 while she ran into the water to find the boy. I ordered the caller to get all the children out of the water and to have all the adults get in, form a line and start searching for the boy. I stayed on the line until the fire department got there, and they found the boy about 10 minutes later, so about 20 minutes after the initial call. They were able to get a pulse when in the ambulance and drove to the hospital. He was later pronounced pass that night, and the hospital called us to let us know, which usually never happens. I was 19 years old, and I had a 7-year-old brother. I held it together, but as soon as I got into my car after my shift, I cried so hard. All I could imagine was that it could have been my brother. And I never get emotional on my calls. I'm able to keep calm, BC. It's not my emergency, but this one hit me right in the stomach. I'm lucky to have had such a good partner to help me through it because I would have struggled doing that alone. I will never ever forget that day. I remember everything that happened like it was yesterday, and it's been 2 years. Story 38. Not me, not 911, but a buddy who was an Army Ranger. They needed evac, but the environment was hostile the entire time. He threw one of his injured teammates over his shoulder and ran for the chopper. Marines came. He said there was a blast. He went down on his knees, managed to get back up and keep running. He went to drop his battle back first onto the floor of the bird. He only had him from the waist down. Basically his legs and boots. From the torso up, he was gone. As messed up as it is, it saved my friend's life. He was an accidental shield, basically. Story 39. Listen to a young escort get beat by a crazy religious guy. She kept struggling for her cell phone, and I could hear the guy yelling crazy stuff about religion and her being an escort. Because of the constant gasps and the phone being thrown around, it was initially hard to make out what was going on. It was a pay-as-you-go phone, so it was hard to find out where she was located exactly. Eventually, her noises stopped, and the guy who did it was left huffing and puffing. Keeping an open line as I'm supposed to do, afterwards, I heard a twinkling noise. Turns out it was him urinating on it. The craziest part of this is that it didn't even make the news. She was young, about 19-ish, indigenous girl, if I recall correctly. This was 2009. I don't do call taking anymore, but whenever people ask what the worst one was, that was probably it. The other one that haunted me was a guy called 911 and said he had a loaded gun and was going to hit people in his apartment, and he told me over the phone I had 5 minutes to convince him not to do it. No one was hurt, thankfully. But he did have a gun and had severe mental problems. I wasn't very long on the job, and there aren't always crazy calls like that, so needless to say, this was a stressful experience. Story 40. Paramedic in the U.S. These last few months have been rough. I'm on a nasty streak of taking people suffering from pandemic out of their homes for the last time and have ended up being on more pediatric patients involved in motor vehicle accidents in the last month than I have in my entire career. It's been rough. The call I cling to, however, still gives me hope for humanity. Last summer, I responded to a playground for a fall patient. Update over the radio was that it was a kid who was unresponsive after falling from a piece of playground equipment. I and EMT show up and observe a group of a dozens or so onlookers standing around a 8-year-old kid still laying on the ground under a tall swing set. Kiddo is breathing, has his eyes open, is able to answer question regarding self, albeit not about what had occurred, and is complaining of head, neck, back pain, but has good sensation and movement of extremities. Not great shape, but we can work with this. One bystander on scene is a young woman who is in athletic attire and is shyly answering questions about what she saw transpire as she was jogging past the scene. I say shyly as she was wearing a sports bra. It was a hot summer day. and was now the center of our attention as we tried to reconstruct what happened prior to transporting this kiddo with no additional info about why he fell. As we placed a cervical collar on the kiddo and packaged them in a pediatric immobilization device, think soft backboard for kids, I noticed that it was a shirt that had been placed under the kid's head that was covering up a small laceration. I looked up at the young woman who, almost crying, immediately started saying that she was sorry. She just didn't know what else to do after she saw this kid fall and not wake up. She took the shirt off of her own back and put it under this kid. Never mind the fact that was the exact wrong thing to do. But this woman did the only thing she could think of, making herself obviously uncomfortable in the process, to comfort someone in a way she thought she could help. The first person to the kid, and the only one to do anything for them, was this young woman. I've laughed on because of calls. I've cried on because of calls. I've lost my cool on because of calls. I've been proud of how we've responded to challenging calls. I've had nightmares over calls. This, however, is my favorite act of humanity that I've seen from a bystander, even if it was medically the wrong decision to make, to literally take the shirt of their back in order to help a stranger. Story 41, not a 911 responder, but I will never forget about hearing this one in my area. Student housing in the city's center wasn't up to code. Someone left something burning in the clothing store below and a huge fire broke out. One student was still inside and couldn't get out because there was no fire escape. Trapped. He called 911. She stayed with him till the end. Story 42, car wreck. Late night, heavily forested mountain road. Drunk woman flying down the highway, lost control and flipped the car multiple times. We arrive and she's unconscious, boarded and shipped. After about 45 minutes, we're gearing up to leave, is when we find the empty baby car seat. Took another 45 minutes to find the body. Story 43, had a guy who was intoxicated and want to end his life and laying on train tracks with a train due by in minutes. We were able to talk him into getting off the tracks and had officers en route, but when he tried to get up, he couldn't because his boot was wedged in between the spokes of the tracks and he could not free it. We tried to get him to undo the laces and slide his foot out, but he couldn't manage that either. Plan C was to stop every train in the entire area until officers were able to get to him. That worked. Story 44. I used to be a volunteer firefighter, and the one that sticks out in my mind was getting a call about an accident involving a semi and motorcycle. The guy driving the motorcycle had a stroke and went under the belly of the trailer, which led to his death. Story 45. When I delivered a woman's in the back of the ambulance. The entire birth, she was on the phone with her friend, having her get the paperwork ready to surrender custody. Story 46. This isn't mine, but my dad went on a call in 1988 where a man had attempted death by hit his wrists. He and his partner each grabbed a wrist, saved the guy's life. But it wasn't until a week later when they found out why he was trying to pass. His wife had left him because of various reasons, I'm sure. But these reasons included the fact that he had full-blown AIDS. So my dad and his friend had to get tested since they had been covered in this dude's red liquid. This was before all the protocols surrounding pathogens had been implemented. My dad was negative, but his friend wasn't so lucky. The blood had gotten in his eye. I was 2 years old at the time. He quit doing calls soon after. His friend passed 7 years ago of AIDS-related things. Story 47. Former firefighter, was riding in the third seat as a trainee on the ambulance. Was a volunteer firefighter and EMT for my local district. But I was trying to become full-time with our only local ambulance service. My father was also in the department and was my station chief. He was almost 70 at the time this happened. Our running joke was that I only joined up to pick him up off the floor or to help him pick up patients. It was the middle of January in the NE corner of the PNW. Cold, snowy, and freezing outside. We got a call in my district for an ATV rollover with a possible broken leg. Arriving at the address, we were greeted by the caller. She told us her father was up cutting firewood and rolled his ATV when he was coming back home. I saw the ambulance my father drove along with another of our brush trucks, so I knew he was on scene with at least another firefighter or EMT. So we trek up this hillside that was either 6 inches of snow or frozen slick, depending on where you step. As we got closer to the ATV, I began to find debris from the ATV, the spout to a gas can, the chain to a chainsaw, the broken bar of a chainsaw, chap, and then the ATV itself. Thankfully, the patient was thrown clear and wasn't pinned. They already had him loaded onto a Stokes, so we began to lower him down the hillside. The whole time I was berating my father for climbing the hillside, since I didn't want another patient. We get this guy back to our ambulance and load him in. I, of course, take of patient care as the trainee. They had already splinted his obviously broken leg, so I was checking for feeling in his feet. My fellow MT had me check his other leg for a baseline to compare the feeling in both feet. In the course of being thrown off his ATV, this man had lost his barn boots, but he still had on woolen socks. My dad had taken one sock off his broken leg to check feeling already, but I didn't take his sock off his other leg. I just palpated his shin and asked him if he felt it. Well, no, I can't. But I lost that leg 15 years ago when I rolled my logging truck, so I don't think that's a bad thing. In my defense, I couldn't feel my hands anyways. Story 48. My dad's a firefighter, and for most of my younger childhood, he didn't expose much of what he's gone through in his career. As I've gotten older, he's shared a bit more and one day shared a perspective with that opened my eyes to the full scope of what he does for the... My brother and I were discussing my brother's military deployment and how some guys from his unit were struggling with PTSD. And my dad said that something that isn't talked about often is how many people walking the street who do what he does often have the same thing happening to them, but for an entire career, lifetime. I asked him what he meant, and he shared with me that it only took him about 3 years on the job before he couldn't truly celebrate any holiday anymore. Obviously, this was met with some confusion in my end, but he said that every holiday, event in the yearly calendar is marred in his memory by some earth-shattering event he was called to for work. Thanksgiving is car wreck, in which the drunk driver walked away while their sober brother was in the passenger. He has an entire calendar year of these, and that was the part that really stunned me. Gave me a whole new respect for the guy. Story 49? Not a 911 responder. My husband and I were on our way out of town to attend a destination wedding. I was sitting at a red light at a highway intersection. A car going 45 miles per hour hit us from behind, shattered our rear windshield. In my adrenaline rush, I got out of the car to check on the driver. It was a woman in her 50s, clearly disoriented. I could tell she was hurt, and I kept asking her to sit still while we waited for an ambulance. She was crying, begging for help. All of my energy went into remaining calm enough to comfort her. She passed out. We were later told she was pronounced dead at the hospital. They think she was in diabetic shock. But what hit her was the internal organ damage she received from the wreck. She wasn't wearing a seatbelt. Sometimes I can still hear her asking for help, looking confused. I'll never let go of the fact that I may have been the last person to... Story 50. Entering a missile silo 60 feet below ground level to rescue 2 stoners in the middle of the Colorado plains. The only thing that saved them were cows at the bottom of the silo. Story 51. Went on a psych call and had a medic student rider. Patient was sitting in a lawn chair in the yard. She refused to answer any questions, so medic student kneels down next to her and asks, "May I check your vitals?" Fast as lightning, she stands up, drops her PJs, rubs her pussy in his face, and says, "You can check my everything." Classic. Story 50. UK cop tutoring a new officer who is just arrested and has called for a van to take prisoner to the cells. I'm following in marked car when a call comes in from ambulance for infant unresponsive. I left the student to go to cells in the van with another officer, and I responded to the infant job, which obviously took precedent. First officer on scene as I am greeted by 2 paramedics clutching a girl doing CPR whilst running to the ambulance. Another student officer turns up, and I shout at him to secure the house and not to let anyone in or out. Shouted quite a lot at that point, realizing the gravity of the situation as I jump in the ambulance with the crew. En route to hospital, paramedic doing CPR and asked me to help out doing some blood sats and other tests. All the while I'm thinking kids are resilient. She will be okay. What seemed like the longest blue light run to hospital ever, and we run into the resus room where there's a team waiting. I have to follow in for evidential continuity and end up assisting in resus. All the while my body camera is running. For over 40 minutes, the medical staff were frantically working to revive her, whilst I was having to call out 5-minute intervals to check for vitals. The main doctor in charge had spoken with mother at this point and updated the team that the girl had been left with her 4-year-old brother in the bath for over 25 months whilst she was downstairs. Not a good family situation. And mother had several issues and had only just got her kids back from care. So things were looking for a bad bit. I was in a state of not really thinking about it. I'd been to lots of incidents involving fatalities, but this was the first one since I had children. After over 40 minutes, they finally stopped and pronounced life extinct. At this point, I just turned and broke down. As a cop with several years' experience mentoring students, I was in tears. My SGT had to come into the room and turn my camera off and take me out. The incident affected me in ways I didn't think I would ever experience. Prior to having kids, I recognized the sadness of such incidents, but I had no relation to it. I ended up on restricted duties. After being sent out on my next shift and not responding well to the imbeciles we normally deal with, and had to go speak with Aki Health to sort myself out. Struggled at home for a while as wife didn't quite understand the world of being a cop and ended up having to hide it at home. It still massively affects me to this day, and every time I bath my kids, I think about it. And every Christmas, as the little girl's first birthday would have been the 23rd of December, a day after my own. It is something I don't think I will ever forget. And I had to relive it by viewing my footage and writing a statement for CID regarding the incident. This was end of November 2018, and I can still remember it as vividly as the day it happened. I have managed to deal with it a lot better with some help and colleague support, but I don't think it will ever leave me. Story 53. I worked as an EMT for a while. Went on a call to a trailer park in town for a man having a heart attack. We get there and discover that it was an elderly man who was under the care of a younger couple. The younger couple was being paid to care for him, except they weren't. They were starving him and using the money for other things. He was dying from lack of nutrition. He had long, white, unkept hair and a beard. He was naked except for an adult diaper. We began CPR, pushed substances, defibrillated him, and loaded him into the ambulance to rush to the hospital. Many of his ribs broke from the CPR, and he'd arch his back and kick once or twice from time to time. He rallied a couple times because he wasn't sick, but he was just too weak, and he passed away. CPS got involved. Story 54. My mom qualified as an ambulance call handler. Once they qualify, they go through a period where an experienced call handler sits with them and listens to the calls with them in case they have any trouble. She passed this with flying colors. It all went downhill after that, though. Here, first ever solo call was from a mother whose baby had fallen out of the car door on a road. Safe to say it ducked her up a bit, but she carried on the job for years afterwards, and now she's a student paramedic. So proud of her, it's unbelievable. Story 55. This was something I heard from a customer, but it cracked me up, so I will share, even though it is secondhand. My customer lived in a rural part of Alaska, where it was at least an hour drive to one hospital and 2 hours to the other closest hospital, assuming good weather. Since it was so rural, and both his parents were EMS, he was trained in it too. He was 16 at the time. One night there's a terrible car accident in snowy weather. His dad responds, and the couple in the car both passes. Since it would be a 4-hour round trip to the morgue, he stopped at home for dinner first. My customer, being a teenager and thinking this would be funny, snuck into the back of the ambulance after dinner. A few miles down the road, Dad lit a cigarette, and he reached up into the cab, grabbed Dad's shoulder and said, "Can I have one of those?" His dad managed not to wreck the ambulance, realized it was his kid and not a car accident victim talking to him, and then made the kid walk home 3 miles in the snow. Story 56. I'd prefer not to revisit my old calls because the few memorable ones ducked me up. But here's one that another rig told us about at the time. Someone called in saying she heard a loud scraping form the roof and thinks her husband fell off while fixing the satellite. They arrived to find he hit himself with the satellite cable and the wife was trying to get him down with a rake. Paramedic had to walk behind the rig and take a deep breath, which was weird. He was normally the embodiment of calm. They get the poor soul down, wife angrily yelling at them to get the guy down before the neighbors see. They load him in the ambulance, and the wife just walked inside after they took down info from her. They got into the rig and drove for about a mile before the paramedic burst out laughing, asking if they just skidooed into a British dark comedy. The reason he dipped out for a second was to regain composure and not laugh. Story 57. I used to take 911 calls. One day this woman calls and says, "My house is on fire and I'm trapped." She then put the phone down, but the line was open. I proceeded to listen to her scream for help as she slowly passed and was consumed in flames. The first responders showed up on scene maybe a minute or two after she passed away. It turned out that her schizophrenic daughter committed arson with the intent of hitting her own mother. The daughter was put in prison, where she passed. 2 victims of one mental illness. Months later, I had my first schizophrenic episode and have since become a full-blown schizophrenic myself. Story 58. Not to me directly, but happened in our firehouse years before. Horror story from the 70 AS. It's shared with everyone to stress the importance of hazardous chemical exposure. There was a chemical leak, I don't know what chemical exactly, and a subsequent fire. The team responded, and one of the firefighters' turnouts ended up getting pretty heavily soaked in the chemical bath. Upon returning to the firehouse, his daughter was there waiting. She gave him a hug and got the chemical all over herself. The substance was extremely toxic, and she got ill and eventually passed a couple days later. The firefighter went through extreme depression afterwards and ended up end his life. Never forget that safety protocols and regulations are written in blood. Story 59. Instead of bringing up a ducked-up call, I'll bring up a funny one. We went for a call to meet the police for an assault. We get there. The guy had been assaulted with a frozen turkey. Whacked with it. Big lump already formed. Guy had gotten into an argument with his old lady and she bopped him with the bird. He ended up fighting the cops and his wife and mother tried to jump in, so I'm holding them back as the cops are wrestling with him. Cops ended up transporting him, so we cleared and went back in service. Turns out the same guy had gotten whacked the week prior too. Story 60. I am no 911 responders, but I can't forget the call from Quebec Mosque guy that was made public 2 years ago. The responder was absolutely marvelous, having him on the phone for more than an hour, helping him not to hit himself with his gun before the cops arrived. Absolute bravo to this person. Story 61. Dad was a police chief. Heard all the stories. Several come to mind from his early career as police officer in the 60s and 70s when it was like the Wild West for cops. In this time, there were not really SWAT teams, negotiators, or bulletproof vests, and everyone carried revolvers and had a shotgun in their car at this department. This particular call was for a hostage situation in a bar. He was the first cop on scene and found a drunk male holding a shotgun to his girlfriends and threatening to hit everyone in the crowded bar, including any cops. Then her, and finally, himself. Shortly after arriving and taking command, another officer came in with a shotgun. Without a bulletproof vest, Dad put himself between the shooter and each bar patron and slowly backed them out the front door while he talked to the suspect, and the other officer had the shotgun on the suspect. They repeated this until Dad had gotten everyone out except himself, the hostage, the shooter, and the other cop. The other officer, with the shotgun, is still a family friend and says Dad didn't budge 1 inch during this time, telling the suspect that if he wanted to hit these people, he was going to have to hit him first, with the other officer assuring the suspect he would follow quickly after. Dad eventually ended up putting himself between the suspect and the girlfriend and eventually talked him into surrendering, and nobody got hurt, including the suspect. He was named the Greater Kansas City Policeman of the Week and received the 1971 Silver Award for Valor, the first one ever given. For his actions saving about 25 people, Dad's passed away in 2007, and I've since donated his award, badges, patches, etc., to that department. They made it into a beautiful shadow box, along with a picture of him, a framed account of the story from the other officer who was there, who went on to do great things in law enforcement. It hangs on the wall for each officer to see on their way out to the motor pool each day to start their shift. Dad was a legit badass when necessary and a terrific cop, as well as a pretty good dad to me. Story 62. I have 2 that stand out for me. First one, I took a 911 call by a woman who said her husband had been pretty depressed lately, but that day felt different, more depressed than usual. She was walking into the bedroom to hand him the phone because she wanted me to talk to him. When she screamed, "No!" then I heard the gunshot. She rushed over to him screaming. I asked her where the wound was, but at first she couldn't tell. She set the phone down while she was looking because that was the only thing she could focus on at the time. She found the wound behind his right ear, and I tried to talk her through everything I could before EMs got there. That day, I listened to him pass. Second, I took a 911 call from a man who didn't speak much English. What I was able to understand was that he was taking a walk near his home when he was attacked by someone, and he blacked out. He woke up in a basement, found a random cell phone that could only dial 911, and called. He had no idea where he was or how long he had been there. The battery on the cell phone was only going to last so long, and I couldn't get his location at the time with it being a deactivated phone that only dialed 911. I got an interpreter on the phone with him, and I tried piecing together where he might be, but then the phone died. You can't call back a deactivated cell phone or trace it through a phone provider. That call was 6 years ago, and I have no idea to this day what happened to him or if he was ever found. 2 calls of many that I will never, ever forget. Story 63. Not a first responder, but when I was hit by a truck, I remember I just closed my eyes and I could just hear someone say, "She isn't going to make it." Scary crap. Story 64. So worked at a place that had an event. Man had gone walking in the morning and his wife was worried as it was early afternoon. Basically, all employees start searching, and after about 15 minutes, we get a call that local cops found the guy. Turns out he was missing because he was cheating on his wife and was found with a different woman. Story 65. Ugh, so many. The one that comes to mind first is when I was dispatching for the county, where most of my memorable stories come from, versus dispatching for the state patrol. I answered the 911 line and just heard ear-splitting shrieks and screams. Tried to get the person to calm down and to no avail. They hung up several times and would sometimes answer on call back, but all I really gathered is that something very bad happened and somebody had a gun. I sent my deputies in blind with MS staging because I assumed somebody got injured. Deputies arrived on scene to find a male pass. He was a semi-prominent political figure in our small town, and he just lost the election for mayor. He passed in front of his girlfriend in the living room. It was like 6 a.m. and I was done at 7 a.m. Was not expecting that. Story 66. Not a 911 responder, but I worked on the recording equipment. Someone called in 2 bodies. There was a woman screaming and crying in the background. The operator asked for the caller's name. He calmly said, "I'm the other one," and hung up. Yeah, I don't think I will ever forget that voice. Story 67. Not a 911 operator, but I used to work for a private company working with police that would contact us with subpoenas or emergency disclosure. There was a situation where a rideshare driver had driven off allegedly on accident with an infant in the back seat when the parents exited the vehicle, before the parents had the chance to open the back door and get the baby out of the back seat. I talked to both the cops and the parents. The guy said he would drop the baby off at the nearest police station. Instead of turning around to drop the baby off, which made everyone mad, then he says, "Oh, I got another ride request, so I will drop it off at a different station that was even farther away." The cop said, "Grab the cell phone from the mother." I was on the dad's line, so I could hear everything. And the cop bellowed out, "If you don't turn around right now, I will duck your whole life up," in the most enraged voice I had ever heard. And the guy turned around and returned the baby immediately. Story 68. I've got 3 that really stick out to me for being unforgettable. First one was a local police officer who passed in a car accident after a pickup truck slid on the ice, slush, and struck his patrol vehicle. I was on the first arriving engine company, and also the first one to the car. The engine block had been pushed from the engine compartment into the passenger compartment. The person that hit him was physically fine, but she knew that she hit him and was in shock. I attended his funeral a few weeks later. Second one was a canoe full of Boy Scouts that tipped over in a river in our area. Because of the current and a downed tree, the Boy Scouts, 6 boys, 1 girl, and the father of 2 of the kids, were clinging to the tree and unable to move to shore. While most of the kids and the dad were above water, the girl had gotten trapped between the overturned canoe and the tree, pinning her underwater. We had 2 divers in the water within a minute or so of our arrival, and we eventually got the dad and the boys to shore with our inflatable boat, but had to spend another 10 minutes trying to free the girl. They eventually did, pulled her to shore and CPR until we could get her onto the stretcher and get her to the hospital, where they pronounced her dead. What stuck with me the most is that, while I didn't know her personally, a lot of people I went to school with did, and there were a lot of memorial services held in her honor. Earlier this year, we went back out there with a tow truck, removed a lot of the overgrown trees, and dug a gravel pathway to the river for easier access, since it was almost all mud before. Third was a call for a guy who fell off of his roof at 2 a.m. in the pouring rain. I remember me and my partner had to take a second and look at each other to make sure we heard the dispatch information correct. When we got out to the place, the guy had indeed fallen off of his roof while trying to fix his TV dish and was lying on his deck. I ended up covering him with my coat to try to keep him warm since he was freezing, and we got him into the ambulance. I remember him saying it was his ex's house and that she was inside, which I thought was especially strange. A few years later, while I was doing an MDA boot drive, a guy stopped and asked if I remembered him, then mentioned he fell from his roof in the early morning, to which I replied that I could never forget something as interesting as that. He said he had to be in a cast for a while since he broke his wrist, but that he was back with his ex and things were going well. Story 69. Buddy of mine is a 911 operator. He had a call where a young kid, like 6 or 7, called in. He was in the woods and didn't know where he was. Also, he had been hit by his father. His mother and father both end their lives. Another call was a guy calling in to say he had just hit his girlfriend. My buddy asked if she was still alive. The guy said to wait just a second. There was a gunshot, and then he said, not anymore. I couldn't do that job. Story 70. My first 999 call running solo after completing training was the wife of a man who had locked himself in the garage and end his life. The most important thing I learned was stay on the line until the police officer. I know that may seem obvious. The police officers drove straight past the house, and I had to redirect them. Story 71. Late January 2008. My crew, 3 of us plus driver, went to call at a post office for an old guy who fell and knocked himself unconscious. We cleared up from that call, drove 2 blocks back to the firehouse, and as we were backing the engine in, we were toned out for a structure fire with confirmed entrapment. We listened to the address and realized it was right across the intersection from where we were just at. We were only a few blocks away, and even then we arrived on scene with smoke showing from the 1st and 2nd floor of a middle-of-the-row townhome. Mom is screaming about her kid being inside still, so we mask up and push a line in. My buddy and I make our way through pitch-black smoke, no kidding hand in front of the face and blind kind of smoke, to get a knock on it while the 3rd guy goes up the stairs for a single-man rescue. We got a good stop on the fire, and my buddy is still nowhere to be found. I make my way back to the front of the house where the stairs were, and I look for him outside, and nothing. I turn my head and see him coming down with this lifeless 4-year-old child. I attempted to call command, but all I got out was command from Wagon 1 and couldn't manage to say anything else. It was all in slow motion. They ended up flying him out, and the kid had a saturation of 18%. We assumed he was not going to live, and we heard nothing more about him until a month later, when he showed up to our firehouse with his parents as healthy as any other 4-year-old kid. I'll never forget that day. Story 72. Not mine, but my friend. He's an EMT, so his partner is always a paramedic. They arrive on scene, and it's this old couple. The wife called saying her husband needs to go to the hospital, but the husband is refusing. He's dying and is already on hospice. He doesn't want to be poked and prodded in hospital when he knows there's nothing they can do to change his prognosis. My friend is packing up his bag in the old man's bedroom after the old man signed AMA. The wife is arguing and yelling with the paramedic in the hallway about taking him. The old man gets out of bed and starts rummaging through his dresser. My friend isn't really watching him. Then bang, old man hit himself right there. My friend just stands there. His partner bolts outside, thinking the old man is going to hit all of them, and the wife is screaming. He had to take the next week off and go through mandatory counseling for a little bit, but he's back at work. Story 73. Police dispatcher took a call from a paramedic suffering from severe PTSD. He was at his secluded cabin and was threatening to shoot himself. The first thing he said to me was, "I will hit you and anyone else that tries coming in here." I spoke to him for over 45 minutes. He hung up a few times, but would always answer when I called him back. We started talking about fishing, religion, family, anything to get him to rethink. He told me he had the gun pointed at the door, and at one point I had him put it on the ground. You could hear the distinct clunk of the gun being dropped. He then told me he was going to let his dog out, and he didn't want the police outside to hit the dog. That was okay. I continued talking to him, trying to convince him to come outside. He shared his story with me, the death and destruction he saw as a paramedic and how much that affected him. That is when he returned to the gun. I plead with him to put it back down. He thanked me for listening and being that friendly voice on the other end. He then said he was going to hang up again because he wanted to spare me from hearing what he was about to do. The line went dead, and on the radio, the officers reported shots fired inside the residence. I tried for a few minutes to ring the line back, hoping he would answer, knowing he would not. I also dispatched police for a very secluded community. No 911, no EMS, no hospital. All the town had was an on-call nurse and police. I answered the phone and heard numerous people yelling, crying, and screaming. Throughout the chaos, I made out one thing: the baby is not breathing. It had been a few years since I took the CPR course. I know there are a few different actions for infants, but I could not remember. My partner called the on-call nurse to wake her up and also called the police to get them going. I tried using Google to look up the steps, but the internet connection in the office was too slow. I had them place the baby on the table and to make sure the airway was clear. I threw my cell phone to my partner and had them call my wife, who is a nurse. It took a couple tries to wake her, but she answered, and with her on speakerphone, I was able to relay information about infant CPR. The child started breathing again, and the family got her to the nurse. I don't know further info on how the child is today, though. What seemed like an eternity, and feeling so completely helpless on my end, was only 3 minutes long phone call. Story 74? Not me, but my dad. Got a call the other night for a 2-year-old having seizures. Any call involving children is hard to deal with, but seizures? I can only imagine what that was like for the parents. Transported the baby to the hospital, where it was later discovered the baby passed away. Story 75. Not a first responder, but I have an event from my military days that I'll never shake. In basic, we had a dude that just wasn't digging it and wanted out. But instead of just letting the guy walk, they would process them out, which for some reason took weeks. So he followed us and did all of the crap work, cleaning gas gear, janitorial, toilets, etc. Nothing good. It was a form of punishment. Well, he hated it and became unstable pretty quickly up until he threatened death. So on died watch he goes. But the watch was literally just guys rotating watch on him throughout the night until they finally sent him home. But these are not trained professionals. These were 19 dudes. And as you might guess would happen, his watch fell asleep on his shift. We wake up to screams, gurgling, and people freaking out. The guy woke up and attempted death by running full speed and face first into a barracks cinder block wall. I'll never know if he lived, and if so, what long-term damage he suffered. The imagery still remains, but what lingers more is how I watched a government system punish someone who clearly needed help, not harassment. Story 76. Not a paramedic, but a family friend passed publicly at an amusement park. She was just a kid with a long history of health problems and collapsed while walking with her little brothers and grandmother. There was a doctor nearby who did CPR on her for something like 20 minutes until an ambulance was able to get all the way through the park to her. The family wanted to thank him for trying, but he wouldn't even give his name. Apparently, he was pretty distraught. He even attended her funeral, left a message in the guest book, but we still don't know his name. Story 77. Not me, but my late grandfather was a cop, and his most traumatic stories happened a little too close to home and while he was off duty. For context, my grandmother is the oldest of 4 sisters. Second sister's husband and my grandfather went on a fishing trip together. They stayed together in a small cabin in the middle of nowhere and would get up at sunrise each morning to go out and fish. On their last day of the trip, my grandfather described routinely awaking with the sun and immediately sensing something was off. He got out of bed and there was no sign of second sister's husband. My grandfather checked the bedroom where second sister's husband had been sleeping to find him cold and pass in the bed. Turns out he had a massive heart attack overnight. There was nothing anyone could have done. Second sister's husband was young and presumably healthy prior. No one saw it coming. My grandfather then had to break the news to second sister that her husband had died, so I'd imagine the whole experience was quite traumatic for him, although he never let on. The next part of the story happened a few years later after the family's annual Christmas party. Third sister had a little too much to drink, and her husband had decided to stay home that year instead of attending the party. So my grandfather offered to drive third sister and her 2 very young girls home. As he pulled into their driveway, he described the same feeling washing over him as that morning on the fishing trip with second sister's husband. Eerie feeling, hair standing on end, the whole 9 yards. So my grandfather instructed third sister and the girls to wait in the car. He entered the house and called out for third sister's husband. Crickets. He ended up finding third sister's husband pass. My grandfather called it into the station, got back in the car, and took them someplace safe. And again, broke the news to one of my grandmother's sisters that her husband had died. Had my grandfather not driven them home that night and instinctually gone in to check the house before they entered, the death would have been discovered by third sister or one of their young daughters. It was sort of a dark, morbid joke for a while in my family that my grandfather was some sort of grim reaper and that fourth sister's husband should watch out. Luckily, fourth sister's husband is still alive and well. He broke the pattern and outlived my grandfather, who passed away peacefully about 10 years ago. I miss him terribly and think of him often. He was a kind, courageous, and selfless man. Story 78. Back in the time before GPS was commonly available everywhere, I was a police officer working a late shift. A call came in that a woman was having a heart attack. Ambulance was en route to an address like 1234 Cherry Street. So I pulled out my old-fashioned paper map of my patrol area and headed to Cherry Street. When I got to Cherry Street, the ambulance was parked with lights going, so I got out and asked why they were just sitting there. They said they couldn't find the address. I checked a few houses, and the numbers were all 5 digits, not 4. So I got in my car and drove really fast in the directions the numbers were going down, then crossed a major intersection, and they started going up again. I confirmed the address with dispatch twice, asked someone to find where the address was located, and they eventually figured out it was Cherry Loop, not Cherry Street, and was in a completely different part of town. So a different ambulance and patrol was dispatched. The woman passed, and there's no way to be certain if Faster M's response could have saved her. But to this day, every time I see streets with the same name, but road, court, way, loop, north, south, etc., it makes me unreasonably angry. We're not going to run out of words or numbers to use to name roadways, so why are we duplicating them? Story 79. I worked for a non-emergency medical line, but still got emergencies sometime. There were a couple of calls where I will never know whether I listened to a person pass on the other end. I was working nights, so maybe they were just tired because of the time of day, or maybe they had stopped functionally breathing and started doing agonal breathing instead. Without emergency intervention, a person doing agonal breathing is either passed. But there was nothing I could do about it except to inform the already en route ambulance crew about it. Another was a whispered call from a carer whose elderly patient was suffering with dementia. He had become so disoriented and confused that he didn't know where he was or who his wife and carer were, and had attacked them with a large stick. The carer was locked in a bathroom and didn't know where his wife was. In the background, I could hear the man shouting and crashing around the house. At one point, the carer whispered, he just saw himself in the mirror and didn't recognize himself, so now he's breaking the mirror. Stayed on the phone until the police and ambulance arrived. Wife and carer were both fine, and the gentleman would receive the help he needed, but I just remember that call. The carer was fantastic and kept so calm, but I felt so awful for everyone in that situation. I also remember a bunch of calls where people had slipped through so many social safety nets. Terrible poverty, terrible social isolation, disoriented elderly people who ought to be receiving more continuous care, repeat callers with chronic mental health problems who would phone us 10 times a night because they knew we'd talk to them nicely when no one else would. That was the stuff that bothered me because I couldn't really help. I could send emergency services if needed or send a message to their GP, and if appropriate, I could report stuff to social service. But I couldn't really help them with their big picture, just piecemeal problems. Some of the repeat callers could recognize me by voice and knew my name. Seemed like our service was the only place they knew to go for someone who'd listen to them. And we still had to push through the call to a clinical outcome in the end. Made me so sad. Story 80, 911 call taker here. Answered a call with a male on the other end. I couldn't make out what he was saying. I remember thinking at the time it sounded like he was trying to talk with a mouthful of marshmallows. All I could make out was when he would muffle, "help," loudly. He called from a cell phone, so I didn't immediately know where he was. I sent police to search the area based on the cell tower his call hit off of. I asked only yes. No questions because I could understand his answers and got all I could. I knew he needed aid and was injured and not sick. Over the course of trying to get more from him, he got more and more quiet, even a few times, hanging up on me, but always answered when I called back. He sounded more and more desperate, and eventually he stopped responding. While on the phone with him, I had a coworker call his cell phone provider and got his subscriber address, and he had an alternate phone number on his account. His address was way outside of our service area. It was unlikely he was at that address, but I had the correct jurisdiction. Do a welfare check anyway. I called the alternate phone number and reached another male, extremely belligerent with me the entire time. I tried to explain the situation to him and found out I was talking to my caller's son. He refused to give me information on where his dad could be, saying he didn't believe I was with 911. It took me telling him to hang up and calling 911 back and asking for my operator number before I could move forward. But the son didn't call 911 back. It was the original caller's wife. So much time wasted. But I find out from the wife that he left for work earlier that morning. I got his work address and asked what kind of vehicle he drives to work. She said she had to go check which vehicle he drove that morning and set the phone down. A few seconds pass and I hear the wife yelling frantically. She runs back to the phone and tells me he's underneath his car in the driveway. When he left for work that morning, he noticed an issue with his car, and he decided to jack up his car and take a look under it. While under, the jack failed, and the front driver's side tire went down right on him, pinning his head between the vehicle's weight and the pavement. He was able to take his cell out of his pocket and dial 911. It was a frustrating call, working with his family to get his whereabouts, but thankfully it had a favorable outcome. Story 81. About 10 years ago, I was doing an internship at the sheriff's office, and part of that was listening and helping at the call center dispatch. The one I will never forget is a lady called in saying she didn't want to pass anymore. Turns out she sent her kids next door while the husband was at work, locked the doors, and took a knife from the kitchen and hid her arms open. The dispatch office went from a really slow, laid-back, joking-around day to all 5 of us working together to get people. If we were lucky, one of the deputies, who is a quick response paramedic unit as well, was patrolling a couple miles away. I don't know if she made it. Her voice and panic is what sticks to me. How you could tell she was concerned about her kids coming back home. The whole thing was pretty emotional for an 18-year-old at the time. Story 82. Any of the dozens of COVID calls I've gotten this year, people don't realize how ducked up it is. Everyone says they get it, but you don't really know until you're 30 minutes in doing compressions on a 20-year-old who had no reason to be dead besides our government's own incompetence. Having to deal with watching multiple people die preventable deaths and then drive home and see people out at bars. Or Facebook posts of people at parties saying it's all a hoax. Having every single person around you act like everything is normal. I'm sick of people calling healthcare workers heroes, when in reality we are the damn fodder our society has collectively decided is responsible for shouldering the cost of this pandemic. The things that I have seen in the last half a year will stick with me for the rest of my life. But don't worry, Starbucks gives me a free coffee this month and Time named us Guardians of the Year, so everything is fine. As if any of that actually means something. Story 83, not a first responder. Not the worst thing I've seen or known to happen. But the one that sticks with me is that I was living in a Midwestern state in my early 20s, and my girlfriend and I were driving across the state in the middle of the night. We both worked into the evening to go to my parents' house. I'm on this stretch of I-90 that was simply flat and boring, and it's 3 a.m. I come up over this small hill and see a fuel truck mangled in the median. I put on my flashers and turned around into the median and went back to the wreck. By this time, another 2 truckers had stopped. We ran to the cab, which was absolutely mangled. The fuel from the tanker itself was leaking. You could smell it. Or it was fuel from the truck. Not sure which was leaking, but there was a lot of fuel. The engine was starting to get really hot, and so we jump into this guy's cab. The truck was resting on its passenger side by this time, and the driver was laying on the passenger side door. I assume he didn't have a seatbelt on. Anyway, the driver was semi-conscious, and I jumped down and helped him stand up. We're all worried that the fuel is going to ignite. So he's able to move, and so I boost him up to the other guys, trying to get him out the driver's side door. I assume the dude lived, but we took off after the ambulance showed up. I got to my parents' house at like 5 a.m. and went into the bathroom to wash up and noticed all the red liquid on me, and it dawned on me that we just may have saved a man's life that night. Story 84. A car accident where an elderly woman was sandwiched in the car and clinging on to life. I held her hand as she passed. Sometimes I still feel her hand squeeze. Story 85. I work in animal control, but we are dispatched through 911. I was dispatched to assist EMs as they were trying to gain access into a home for a down party, but 2 aggressive Belgian Malinois, think more hyper version of a German Shepherd, were not allowing them to get inside. I show up and I'm able to get both dogs back. At this point, I see the body of the owner. He had clearly passed several days prior, collapsed on the kitchen floor. He was fully dressed in jeans and a hoodie, was able to impound both dogs. No one else lived at the home. There was also a super elderly Yorkie wearing a fully saturated diaper that I could not believe the aggressive dogs had not messed with. Found out a few days later from the family of the deceased party that the man who had died had helped train attacked dogs. His Malinois were worth $40,000 each. Luckily, they weren't too bad to handle. Dogs ended up being returned to one of the other trainers per the wishes of the family. The trainer even took the Yorkie too, so he wasn't separated from his dog's siblings. Story 86. I'm not a responder, but I was really close to a family who went through this. When I was a senior in high school, a sophomore who I played baseball with took his own life late at night in a small park a few blocks from the school. His dad was a firefighter, paramedic, and was a responder to this. He performed CPR on his son for nearly half an hour because he wasn't willing to pronounce him dead. That shook our small community really hard, and that is still one of the saddest funerals I've ever been to. Story 87. Responded to a jet ski accident a few years back. The kid was horsing around on the ski too close to the dock and got thrown off onto the dock. Story 88. Listening to the screams of a 5-year-old and his parents when their 4-wheeler's gas tank exploded, showering they with flaming gasoline. It was about 4 minutes until firefighters and EMTs arrived on scene, and I remember every second. Story 89. 20 years ago, I was still in MT school and was doing a ride along with paramedics in a rescue. Call was woman in labor at $100 a week cash hotel. There aren't doors on the units, just bead curtains. Each unit is one of 12 spaces with a kitchen and bathroom on each floor. When we get there, the elevator is out of service, so the engine crew started carrying the gurney up the stairs. I've got the tackle box and the Zoll. Everybody decided that I'd be running the call. They sort of pushed me into the room, but everybody was still behind the doorway. The mom-to-be was lying on the bed with her knees up. They asked me if we were going to stay and play, or are we going to load and go? I wiped the Oreo cookie crumbs off the bed and checked for crowning. None. I said we were going to load and go. At this point, the medics and firefighters were still behind the doorway. They rolled the gurney to me. I adjusted the sheet on the gurney, wiped the Oreo cookies off the bed again, and helped her onto the gurney. I strapped her to the gurney and handed her off to the engine crew that was going to carry her in the gurney down 4 flights of stairs. I ran ahead with the Zoll and tackle box to the rescue. When I got to the rescue, the EMS captain that happened to come to this call had witnessed my entire performance. He asked me, "What was that sweeping motion you were doing to her bed?" I told him that I was sweeping away the Oreo cookie crumbs. He said, "Those weren't Oreos." There I was, 1600 in the afternoon, in downtown Los Angeles, quickly removing my pants and smacking them on the side of the rig to remove the hundreds of cockroaches. That, ladies and gentlemen, is why I am a huge proponent of verifying scene safety before you walk into a room. I then also realized why all the FFs and PMs wear rubber bands on their boots. And, finally, don't smack your cockroach-filled pants on the side of the rig. You'll find out that you will have to wash the rig when you get back to the station. Story 90. Not a 911 responder, but I was a lifeguard at a public pool. Fairly overweight man who was a regular at the pool had trouble walking, so he used a walker to get around. Today was a bad day for him, and he was unable to get out of the pool with the ladder, so we had to use the lift to get him out. Later in the day, I'm on break, and we hear over the radio, "Can anyone on break come over with first aid? Someone's toe lost." Me and my friend get the first aid kit and run over to the pool to find the guy sitting on his walker with his big toe. We were, of course, stunned because we have never seen something like this before, and we're only trained for CPR and spinal inquires. We quickly get gauze onto his toe and start applying pressure. We have one of the security guards call 911 as we continue to change the gauze and apply pressure while trying to keep him calm. He was very distraught, obviously, but I kept him calm and told him that he wouldn't lose his toe and that I'd seen something like this at another pool I worked at and the person kept their toe. I hadn't. The paramedics finally arrived and wrapped up his foot and took him out on the stretcher. He ended up keeping his toe, and we saw him back at the pool in less than a week, and he thanked us for saving his toe. Not swimming. The rest of the day, I continuously made toe puns to my boss and other lifeguards. Story 91. Not mine. When I was in school, my language arts teacher told us about when she got a call about a giant swarm of bees attacking a town. Apparently, the swarm was more than one hive, and the amount of bees was in the thousands. Story 92. Most people think it is the gory calls that get to you. It's actually the human calls. Back when I worked inter-facility transfer, we had this call for a pregnant woman who was high risk. It turns out her child passed. I don't remember the reasons not, but she had to carry that child to term and be in the hospital. I will never forget the grief that just radiated off her. She truly looked like a completely broken person, just someone sitting there staring off into nothing. Story 93. I once responded to a car accident, and we showed up when everything was sorted. No injuries, and one of the cars were good enough to drive away. We just did some cleanup, and then suddenly we get a call saying there was another accident just down the street. So we move out down the street, and it turned out the tow truck sent to pick up the car from the first accident came over an overpass too hot and rammed 2 other cars. The cars were destroyed, but luckily there were again no injuries. The lady in the one car that was smashed like a pop can was screaming at the tow truck driver and pointing to her car as he had a smoke and stared into the sky with resignation. The irony made it unforgettable. Story 94. One night around 6 p.m. on a foggy fall evening, eating dinner with the family and hear a gunshot from next door. Neighbor was an awesome lady, but was struggling with PTSD for a long time. Dad's AMT, I have a lot of first aid experience. We look at each other and kind of knew, so we get up from the table and walk to the door. Saw my neighbor in her backyard sitting in a lawn chair slumped over. Get mom to call 911 and get an ambulance rolling. Ram hop the fence and call her name to check for response. Nothing. Then I hear that last rattling, sucking breath and nothing. See the revolver in her hand. We secure the weapon and drag her off the chair cut of exterior jacket. And see the wound, apply pressure, and start compressions. Rural area, so an ambulance took about 15 minutes. We tried, but there was really nothing we could do. My parents live in the same home still, and some foggy evenings when the floodlight is on, I feel like I can still hear those final ragged breaths and see her slumped over, clutching the 2 photos of her daughters, revolver in hand and an empty beer bottle beside her. I've seen some crazy crap, but that one got me. Story 95. When I was 16, I had a summer job working at a marina at a local lake. This was early 90s, and cell phones weren't around. The road to the lake was a twisting, winding, paved road that drivers of sports cars loved. I came around a corner and could tell something bad happened. Out of the corner was a bright yellow Corvette Convert, Able upside down and smoking, going too fast and flipped. I rush out to check. The driver had hit head. I hear moaning and go to the passenger side. The man's wife was still alive but severely injured. I had enough room to reach my hand in to hold hers. She passed away a few minutes later. It haunts me to this day. I hope that holding her hand made her passing a little better, if that makes sense. Story 96. My dog called 911 once when I was a little girl. It was back when car phones were a thing, and we had one in our minivan. My little dog was walking on the floor of the van, and she pressed redial. On the phone, keys were face up. Turns out the prior call was my mom reporting a wreck, so my little dog called 911. My mom picked up the phone and apologized, and I like to think that the operator was amused. Story 97. Not me, but I have an acquaintance who is an EMT. Got a call for an attempted death. 22-year-old male, found by his parents when they got home from church. When they got to the scene, he was very clearly gone. They worked on him just for his parents' sake, but it became obvious to them very quickly that he was passed. He was my friend. We were in marching band together. He was the nicest person I have ever met and could make anybody laugh. He was really good at playing the tuba. He wasn't the best runner, but he was the best cross-country teammate. He was, and still is, so loved. Story 98. Been on plenty of wild calls, but really only one pops into my head more than the others. And it's fairly mild compared to some of the horror shows on here, but this one just sticks with me. Got called to a motel early morning for a woman in her 30s with an overdose. Arrived, and the check-in lady said she thinks the patient is already passed. Got to the room. Patient is definitely passed. Rigor and lividity confirmed. She passed sometime during the night. Nothing we can do. Oxyarch's on the little side table with her name. Just an average accidental overdose like the 100 others I've been on. The only difference, and the reason I still remember this one after years, is that she wasn't alone in the hotel room. She and her elderly parents had been making a trip, and they were there, sleeping in the other bed. And I guess it's just the thought that stuck with me. How helpless or guilty those parents must. They were sleeping 4 feet from their child, passing from something that could have been fixed if one of them had just rolled over or needed to use the bathroom. But they didn't, and she passed some time in the night. I don't think about it often, but it just sort of gnaws at me when I do. Story 99. On the positive side of things, I dispatch for a rural area. Brand new to the job, and I get a 911 call where they report a horse lying down in a field. I ask if they think it's injured or dead. Nope, it's just usually standing. Deputy checks it out for craps and giggles, and it's just taking a break. Story 100. One of my first calls after getting a job as a firefighter was responding to a traffic collision on the highway very close to my old station at around 0230 in the morning. A car with 5 intoxicated occupants drove onto the highway off-ramp and onto the highway going the wrong direction. After rounding a blind corner, they collided with a car going the correct direction. With the combined speed of 2 vehicles going at or over highway speed, the scene was a disaster. There was so much energy in the collision, the motor of one of the cars got completely detached and ended up nearly 100 feet down the road. The driver of the car going the correct direction was a young girl, about the same age as I at the time, and went to my school. The occupants of the vehicle going the wrong direction were all seriously or critically injured, but in the long run, survived. Extrication of the girl's body was a laborious process, and I just kept thinking of the unfairness of it all, and the reality and seriousness of the job set in for the first time. There have been many other calls since then that are objectively worse, but I will still remember that one until the day I die. Story 101. Got called to an apartment building for an unknown. Caller went into his closet and noticed what red liquid coming through the ceiling. After waiting for specialized police units to make entry, we get into the apartment above to find a young lady that ended her life. Reminded me of some Japanese horror movie character. I was with a brand new EMT and asked if he was going to check for a pulse, then immediately stopped him when he started walking over to do it. Story 102. This is my diving safety officer's story, not mine. He used to work down in Keys and volunteered on their diving rescue and recovery team. This group of 8, 10 divers were experienced divers and all certified, etc. Their dive was on the coral reef where it was 40 feet, but there was a drop off to 80, 100 feet more. Their dive plan was to stay at the higher end and not go down that deep. Well, the dive went smoothly until the end when they were ascending, and got to surface and noticed that one of the divers, male, wasn't there. His diving buddy, female, decided to go back down and find him while everyone else was up on the boat. Neither of them surfaced, and they called my DSO's team to search for them. It took a while to call and get them out there. It was around 12 hours later, so the chances of finding them alive were basically 0, and they knew this going in. Well, after a while of searching, my DSO came across the bodies. One of them was laying on the seafloor, and the other one was bent over her, in the same positions they had passed in hours earlier, which is surreal in its own right. The regulator that they were sharing was floating in between then, and the man was incredibly overweighted by 20 or so pounds. The tank was half full of oxygen. They had fought over the regulator and both passed their positions, and the fact that the tank still had air in it, and that it was nighttime when they found them seared that image into my DSO's head. He now uses it as a lesson regarding air sharing, which is not used unless absolutely necessary, and being overweighted since the guy couldn't resurface. Story 103. I'm an MT for a rural volunteer BLS department. We got a page early in the morning for an OnStar activation that reported a high potential for severe injuries at a 2-vehicle MVA. At the time, I'd been licensed for about 3 or 4 months, but I'd been a ride-along for over a year on my department, but I digress. We arrive on scene to see an SUV on its side and a 4-door sedan about 20 yards down the road. They were just setting up. It was that mangled. I get up to the car to check what I can, but there wasn't much I could see because of how much damage was done to the vehicle. I called for a higher-level provider to get to that vehicle ASAP. The patient was beyond critical and was taken by an AMP service, but I found out later that the patient didn't make it to the hospital. Another one was a similar morning EMVA. We were paged to a pickup versus tanker truck with one subject ejected. Arrived on scene and the fire chief met us at and told us to just bring a sheet. The ejected subject passed on arrival with massive injury. We stayed to help the coroner move the victim into the van. Got home and found out that somebody posted picture of the scene on Facebook, and one almost showed the victim's body. That infuriates me and others that responded to this day. Story 104. Dad was out duck hunting with his lifelong hunting buddy, who we will call Jay. Jay had a couple Labradors for jumping and retrieving the ducks. He had one with him that trip. They had been sitting for a while at the edge of a levee and hadn't seen any ducks in a while. They both decided to walk around the levee to see if they had any luck there. Jay and the dog went one way. My dad went the other way. Jay got back first. When Jay sat back down, he laid his camo shotgun down with the safety on, with the barrel pointing the direction where my dad had been sitting. My dad got back a few minutes later, and the dog was excited and happy to see him again. The dog ran over to my dad and stepped on the gun. He stepped on it just right. That he released the safety and almost simultaneously pulled the trigger. The edge of the pattern hit my dad's thigh. He was life-flighted out to a nearby hospital. One of the spots he was hit missed his femoral artery by millimeters. He's fine, and this was about 10 years ago. Story 105. It came over as a dog attack on a girl. It was specified as a pit bull and to be careful and wait for police backup. We all mentality prepared ourselves for a horror show. We get there and the little girl was happily playing with her very gentle dog with a SCD knee. The babysitter overreacted and couldn't articulate to dispatch anything useful. Dispatch understandably assumed the worst. Biggest relief of my entire career. Story 106. I'm a volunteer firefighter. We got called out to car accident. When we got there, the driver had gotten himself out, but was very dazed, confused, said he was with his baby girl. But we couldn't find her. There was a bunch of stuff that was thrown from the car, clothes, tools, toys, etc. We had to go through everything looking for her, kept picking up pieces of clothing, expecting to see a little girl laying there. I was the longest, shortest time of my life. Happy ending, the guy was confused. He didn't actually have his daughter with him. My daughter was born about 6 weeks before that accident. Gave me some nightmares for a while. Story 107. The one job that stays with me for 10 plus years was a woman stepped off the curb to cross the street after a landscaping truck had passed her. However, she somehow stepped in between the truck and the trailer and was knocked down and ran over in a very odd fashion. 2 things stick out with this to this day, and that is, she was face down, but her legs were straight out to the left and right, almost making a letter with her body. The landscaping truck, I believe, was driven by her husband, adding another lever of insanity to the scene. By the time we got an ambulance until we parlayed her and I tubed her, she kept whispering, "Please don't let me die." My Lartner pumped her with 3L of LR and instructed the EMT to apply pressure to her pelvic area, where she was open from mid-thigh to mid-thigh. Arrived to trauma and turned over to one of the better-known trauma docs. Found out she passed a few hours later after receiving over 90 units of blood as they tried to repair all the damage. Yep, still heard that voice. Story 108. 1991, East Texas. Late model Mustang at high speed versus live oak tree, maybe 8 to 10 inches diameter. Tree falls right down the middle of the car. There were 4 occupants, all seriously entrapped. The first patient was relatively easy. They ended up life-flighting him from the hospital to a trauma center. The other 3 were extricated over the next few hours, 3 hours. We had helicopters landing in the field across from the accident. Pulled in one from Galveston, almost 100 miles away. Even by today's standards, it was pretty dramatic, but for 1991 to be pulling in 4 helicopters for one wreck, that was a lot. I'm pretty sure all 4 lived. Story 109. This was about 10 years ago now. I used to be a volunteer EMT. We got a call for a child not breathing. We were less than a mile away from the house. We arrived on the scene to see a father standing in the driveway of the house with his young daughter in his arms, limp, not breathing, with vomit all over. We get her into the ambulance with 2 paramedics and 3 EMTs working her. We rush to the hospital and get her inside and work her for what felt like an hour. Nothing. I left the ear and was sitting on the ground next to the ambulance. Her parents roll up in panic asking what happened. They saw my face. Walked them in and the doctor gave them the news. Everyone was devastated. Apparently, she had a rare disease. No, I don't remember. And it was only a matter of time for her anyway. Dad gives me a hug and thanks me for trying. I think about it all the time. Story 110. My girlfriend also works in MS. She recently had a motorcycle accident. The motorcyclist was a woman who was hit head-on at highway speeds. Her husband was on the bike behind her and saw the whole thing happen. Story 111. This one is less straight-up horrifying than others, but it will always stick with me. Station gets a call around 4 a.m. from a unit from a nearby station that's already on a call, asking if we have a specific piece of equipment called a sked. Basically, imagine a giant semi-flexible plastic sheet, which in addition to other uses, lowers friction when dragging heavy objects over flat surfaces. We tell them that yes, we do have the largest size sked available, and they say great, come join the party. We arrive on scene to find that 3 other units already there. We come into the patient's apartment, crowded with EMS and fire personnel, to find an at least 800-pound person in their room experiencing minor breathing problem. Turns out by the time we got there, another station had showed up with a sked large enough and they were already working at getting it underneath the person. Fast forward to them getting the person all the way to the doorway of the room. When they realized that not only is this person too large to fit through the doorway, but too much even for the hallway behind it. At this point, my station was relieved so we could be available for other calls. But according to officer in charge, the plan when we left was to extend a ladder to the exterior wall of the apartment building, knock it out, and bring the person down on the ladder. From what I heard, the patient hadn't left that room for 7 years prior to the call. Story 112, paramedic here. Motorcycle accident. Guy going probably 120 tried to pass a car on a double yellow line going down a hill around a curve, screws the pooch and goes head-on into an oncoming car and then is hurled back toward the car he passed. The driver of the car he hit head-on let out a low, keening wail when he saw what was in the road after we got him out of his own totaled car. That sound was almost as bad as the mess in the road, another one. Young guy going way too fast on a motorcycle. Young woman turning left, sees the bike, but it's so far away she makes her turn anyway, not able to fathom how fast he's going. He hits her Civic in the rear corner panel and spins her car 180 degree. He came to dead stop so hard. Story 113. Firefighter, paramedic, I was fairly new at the time, responded to report of a shooting at a home, possibly 2 PTs. Arrived right behind PD who always goes in to clear these scenes. From our staging location, we had a clear view of the front door, and I will never forget this. 3 small children, like 10 years and under, run out of the front door to the police officer. I could feel their terror. Scene is cleared, and we make our way inside to find an individual in the living room who try to end his life. This resulted in the individual blowing their face off but alive. Back bedroom is another individual. Pass. We ended up saving the guy who hit his children's mother in front of them, then hit himself in front of them. This haunts me today and always will to think of how absolutely devastating and traumatic that must have been for those poor babies. Story 114. Long story. My dad is the fire chief of our town. Also does hazmat and first response. In high school, my dad called me 100 times after school, and I didn't answer because I was in a hole. Get home to my parents, furious. Dad gets a call about 4 teenagers in an accident. All pass on arrival. It was on the road right outside of my high school. They crossed the center line going around a curve, hit a semi head-on. My dad was terrified to show up before my sister and I are alive.